we've been talking about the church. We're going to transition off of that now, but we ended up last week with the whole comparison of the relationship between the church and Christ with the relationship between the man and woman in marriage. Now we know that's not a perfect analogy. Marriages here on earth can be sort of messy, and we all know realities, but it does give us a picture, at least in the ideal, of the relationship between Christ and his church, which, come to think of it, we know can be messy as well, because people are involved. But we sort of ended with the idea of the marriage of the Lamb and the marriage supper and things like that. And those were all future things to us. And I just sort of asserted that, and we looked at some of the scriptures to sort of say, we talked about how we were sort of in this period, this betrothal period between when they become, this spousal period, between when they become betrothed or engaged is sort of our vernacular, but it's much more meaningful than what we think of being engaged. It's a lawfully binding relationship, but has not been fully executed, and that sometime in the future it will. And we saw how that was an analogy. So we're going to transition from there, but sort of tied into that with the idea of the future events. What's going to happen in the future? And this will probably take us to the end of this study at the end of this month. But we'll look at some future things. But and by the way, this is a very complex topic. We're not going to cover everything in obviously a couple of weeks. Matter of fact, we're in the middle of planning a year-long course at KBBI on this very topic. So it's going to take us a year to study that, and we still won't get to all the depths of it. But nonetheless, we'll at least get some of the basic ideas out here in this week and the next couple of weeks. But I want to start it with this. Anyone recognize this book? Say, of course we don't recognize it. You can't even see the cover of it. Maybe you can a little bit better recognize this book. This is another copy of it, a more recent copy. It's called The Late Great Planet Earth. Anyone ever hear of that book? Yeah, some of you older folks are nodding your heads. If you're my age, you've heard of this book. As a matter of fact, that takes me to this copy of the book, which on the front, it says The Late Great Planet Earth, and is written the words Davis Calvary United Methodist Church. That's the church I went to when I was a teenager. And as a teenager, back in the 70s, we actually studied this book in our teen class. As a matter of fact, this is the very copy I studied out of, which I know you're expecting it should be written in papyrus or something like that. Not quite that old, but almost. The book was actually written in 1970, and I want to use that sort of as an introduction to this topic, and we're going to start going. So book. So some of you have heard of the book, right? Anybody not heard of the book? Surely some of you have not heard of the book as well. Late Great Planet Earth was a book written by a guy by the name of Hal Lindsey. And back in the 1970s, he was a very famous televangelist and book writer. He had a long-running TV series called the Hal Lindsey Report, and he published lots of books. I think he ended up publishing 25 books or so. He ended up passing away just a couple of years ago. But this was his first and really biggest one. It was originally put out by Zondervan, which is a religious publisher, but it became so big that it was later put out by Bantam Press. Matter of fact, this one might even been put out by Bantam. I don't remember. No, that's the Zondervan version. That's actually the Bantam version. And it ended up became a nationwide bestseller. It was, the New York Times declared it the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s. That's how wide it was. By 1990, some 28 million copies had been sold. The book was adapted into a primetime TV special, which drew 17 million viewers. And in 1978, they adapted it into a film narrated by Orson Welles. Okay, so this back in when I was developing teen, this was all a big deal. And like I said, it had lots of sequels, including Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, There's a New World Coming, and the 1980s Countdown to Armageddon. Some pithy critic once wrote, every 3 years, Hal Lindsey writes a new book denoting how the world will end in 5 years. Each subsequent book explains how he wasn't wrong in the previous book, and the world will really end in 5 years. Okay? And that sort of gets us down to what the book says. We won't go through all the theology and eschatology. Eschatology is the fancy word about the study of end times. We won't go through all that for the book, but it's the basic idea that that Christ is going to return in the rapture and he didn't put an exact date at it, but it was basically 40 years after the creation of the nation state of Israel in 1948. So 1988. Now you can imagine the impact of this on me in the 70s, early 70s. Here I am, thinking, what am I going to do for college? What am I going to do for a career? And, go to school, young man, and study hard and get good grades and get degrees and go get a good job and say, oh, by the way, world's going to end in 1988. So, luckily, I didn't really make that connection or anything like that. But the big thing is that Hal Lindsey wasn't the only one. There were buckets and buckets of folks with those kinds of predictions. Christianity Today, the magazine, even had a term for that period of time. They called it doomsday chic. Chic is like what's cool, and it was cool to be writing about doomsday scenarios and things like that. Now, I don't want to pretend like that's totally gone away, right? You all can turn on the TV and you can hear some telepreacher saying, the world's about ready to end, and here's some reasons and things like that. And by the way, that happened long before Hal Lindsey showed up. As a matter of fact, we have another KBBI course where we basically sit around and laugh at some of the predictions over the last 2,000 years about failed prophecies about how the world is going to come to end. Purpose of the course isn't really just to laugh at people, although that's always fun. The purpose of the course is we do some look at different views of eschatology and things like that through the course. But we're not going to teach that course here. I just wanted to bring up this thing of Hal Lindsey and this idea of yesterday. He had a tagline that said, yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. And he had a unique way in which he sort of associated everything that was happening in prophecy and connecting it with real-time world events and saying, oh, see, this headline proves this and this, all this. And it was sort of hardwired in a nice way. Of course, the problem is, did the world end and did Christ return in 1988? Well, we have no evidence to suggest that, at least not in the way that he said it would, right? Here we are now, another 50 years later, and still nothing. That causes us to pause as we talk about, end time events and things like that. We have to keep in mind there are a whole lot of things we don't know, but there are a bunch of things we can know as well. And most of you are probably familiar with I would call it the standard premillennial view, dispensationalist view of the rapture and the second coming and the millennium and all that kind of stuff. We're going to sort of study all that stuff. So if those phrases aren't familiar with you, don't worry about it. We're going to cover some of that stuff. But for some of you, you might have some sort of familiarity with that already. But before I go too far into that, we want to look at some other ways of thinking and stuff like that. So let's start with what the Bible says, a few Bible verses about the second coming of Christ. Okay? By the way, somewhere around a quarter of the Bible is prophetic in nature. Think about that. About 25% of the Bible is prophecy. Now, some of that was prophetic when it was written, but past for us, and some of it is still future. As a matter of fact, one guy estimated that there were 1,817 specific prophecies in the Old Testament and in the New Testament combined. How you get that number, depends on how you define a prophecy and all that kind of stuff, and what do you lump together and all that. But that's a lot of prophesying, right? A quarter of the Bible. And the guy that estimated this, 1,800 of them, estimated that about half of them have already been fulfilled for us today, and half of them are still unfulfilled. So that gives us some sort of setting when we start talking about prophecies. Keep that in mind. And by the way, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. For instance, there's some things that we believe we would call partially fulfilled. And there's even a couple of ways things can be partially fulfilled, but in a lot of cases, we believe that the same prophecy refers to both near-term events, near-term to the guy giving the prophecy, coming up on his radar, and then also a longer term. And often that we're in the valley between that near term and that long term, although sometimes we're sitting here past the long term as well, and sometimes we're still, not even to it being fulfilled once. And when that happens, we call that partial fulfillment. And as a matter of fact, usually the first fulfilling is sort of a shadow or a hint on what's going to be fulfilled. And Ronnie, you're dying with the question.
Out of the prophecies that have been fulfilled or will occur, can we look back at it from a point of view like a history book, look it up?
You sure can. As a matter of fact, we're going to do some of the great straight man, Ronnie, as usual.
What were those? What they prophesied? What happened?
We're gonna look at some specific things next week, okay? But I'm gonna address what you said right now, okay?
Look them up.
We're gonna look up some things. We're gonna look up, like when you go look at Daniel, and we'll talk about that next week, about Daniel's prophecy about the different kingdoms and then what actually happened about the kingdoms. Yeah, it's the chapters right before that and right after that.
I want to know what they said was going to happen.
Hang on to us. We'll talk about that some. Because I do want to address the other part of your question. This amount of prophecy makes the Bible unique among religious writings. There's this idea of predictive prophecy. There's no emphasis on predictive prophecy in like the Islamic Quran or in the Hadiths, or the Hindu Vedas or the Buddhist Tripitaka, the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib. That's what the Sikhs. Those are the different writings of some different groups, like the Sikhs and the Hindus and the Muslims. Different religious groups, right. Confucianism has the 5 classics, I Ching and Book of Rites, and I don't remember what the other ones are. But, Shinto has the Kojiki, and Tao has the Tao Te Ching. But none of those really do predictive prophecy. The Bible is unique. Not only is the Bible unique in the fact that it's actually predicting the future events here on earth, but it also repeatedly points to fulfilled prophecy as direct proof that it's God speaking. The word prophecy actually means like a mouthpiece of God, someone speaking for God. But in the scriptures, in the Bible, it says the way that and we'll read the verse in just a second, but the way in which you can judge whether someone is speaking for God or not is he giving predictions, prophecies that come true or not?
Yeah. Talking about the ones in the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament, yeah, and there's actually lots of stuff in the New Testament too, and we're going to talk about some of that. Hang on to that. Yep.
Jesus proves it then.
Yep. We're gonna talk all about that. You bingo, Ronnie. It says, Deuteronomy 18:22. It says, "When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken. But the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him." Okay. To give you a little bit more context for that verse, this is God talking to Moses, and Moses is basically saying, well, if I say that you told me to say something, how will the people know that what I'm saying comes from you? And God is saying, well, tell you what, Moses, this is the paraphrased version, tell you what, Moses, and the other prophets, I will give you predictions, and if those predictions come true, people are going to say, I ought to listen to you. But also, it's a works the other way as well. If someone else comes along and gives a prediction and it doesn't come true, we know not to believe them. Whoa, there's homework that can be graded on prophets. And you can evaluate the prophet on whether the things he says come true or not. If they come true, pay attention to him. He's speaking for God. If they don't come true, now, we have to be mature about this. We have to realize some things have just not come true yet. We don't get to prematurely say, well, that didn't come true. Well, it may still in the future, but nonetheless, this proves to be a very useful rule to him. And most commentators would believe that the verse we just read, as a matter of fact, in where I read, it capitalized the prophet there. It wasn't just talking about any prophet. If it capitalized the word prophet, what do you think he's talking about? Christ, Jesus, right. Most commentators believe that this is a reference to not just the regular prophets that we think of, like Isaiah and Ezra and Nehemiah and Jonah and all those guys that get their names on those little books that are hide there inside your Old Testament, right? They only get a few pages, but they have some real interesting prophecies in those few pages. But ultimately to the prophet himself, Jesus, the mouthpiece of God himself, Jesus. And it makes sense that we would call Jesus the prophet in this sense because he was speaking for God. Why was he speaking for God? Because he was God. Okay? So most, not all, but most of the unfulfilled prophecies of the scriptures center around the second coming of Christ. That's why we're sort of talking about it in this context. Now, when you think about it, that's not really surprising. After all, the coming of Christ to earth is the center theme of the entire scriptures, right? The coming of Christ to the earth in order to save mankind and redeem the creation. That's the theme of the Bible. We understand that in terms of it's the first advent, the first coming, and the second coming. And when did the first coming happen? You won't get an easier question than this one. When does the first advent? When did Christ come the first time?
First time.
Yeah, did Christ come?
He's been here more than once.
Has he?
Yes.
Well, he's been here once. We're going to ignore the things called Christophanies. We talked about that a long time ago and things like that. But Jesus came as a baby, lived a life, and died on the cross. That's his first advent. Now we'll look at some verses, and that fulfilled a whole bunch of prophecies, that very act. But there's a bunch of prophecies about him, some given by him, some given by other people. Huh?
When he showed his wounds.
Yeah, and things like that, yeah.
I'm coming back.
Yeah, and then he says, I'm coming back. And we're going to read some verses on that. Matter of fact, let's read them right now. Okay? And these are just a few of the verses, but these are enough to sort of really get us going. So we'll read, first of all, John 14, 1-3. Okay? John 14 is at the Last Supper. Most of these verses you've all heard before, but it's good to think of them in this context. John 14, 1-3. This is at the Last Supper and afterwards, and Jesus is talking with the disciples, and he says, and by the way, they're all worried, right? Because at the end of chapter 13, he says, guess what, guys? I'm leaving you. They didn't even really realize he was talking like that night. The next day, he was leaving them. But he says, I'm leaving you. And starting in chapter 14, he says, let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And we talked about those verses last week. Now we're going to, and this is connection to what we talked about last week. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. We looked at in the context of the marriage the marriage of the Lamb and things like that. But let's think about that now in the context of this second coming. Christ is saying, I'm leaving, but I'm coming again. I'm coming a second time. A little bit later, at the ascension. So Jesus has resurrected, appeared to the disciples and to other folks, hundreds of people. And now it's time for him to ascend up in heaven. Acts 1:10-11. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, so Jesus has just ascended, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel. Who do you think the two men in white apparel were? Who runs around in white apparel? Probably angels, right? Okay, so these are angelic messengers.
You said they had halos.
Yeah, nowhere does the Bible say that angels have halos, but we won't chase down that rabbit at the moment. Two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? Now, that comment by itself is almost funny, right? First of all, the disciples have seen Jesus who's risen from the dead and walked around with him, and now raises up into heaven, disappears into the clouds, and what are they doing? Well, what would you be doing? Let's be honest. You're sitting there gawking at it, right? And the angel comes by and says, what are you guys looking at? You know? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. We'll come back to some of these verses later when we talk about the actual details of the second coming, about how the idea that just as he went up, he came back, things like that. But right away we say, whoa, wait a minute now. Just like he left, he's coming back a second time. In Hebrews, there's a couple of verses that contrast the first and the second coming sort of in the same phrase. Hebrews 9:27-28. And it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. Okay, right there's a whole lot of weight in those words, right? A whole lot of theology. So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time, without sin, unto salvation. We've talked several times about, this idea that in one sense our salvation is complete now. In another sense, our salvation won't be complete until Christ returns. Why isn't our salvation complete now? Well, we still carry around these sinful bodies, right? And so we still live in the presence of sin. Presence of sin in ourselves, presence of sin all around us. The world around us is corrupt and decaying. Christ's first advent, his first appearing, his death on the cross made salvation available to us, and we avail ourselves of that salvation. We're just as saved as we're ever going to get, but it's not been totally consummated until he returns a second time. That's what he's saying in those previous, I go and build you a house and all that kind of stuff, and that's what he's saying here. He shall appear the second time without sin unto salvation. And he discusses that for a while longer in that chapter and into chapter 10 and verses 24 and 25. Favorite verses, Hebrews 10, 24, 25. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. We always use that to tell people, hey, you got to be in church, right? Don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. That's the context. But it gives a special reason for that. It says, but exhorting one another, why should we be faithful in our attendance? Not just attendance on Sunday mornings, but our participation in this thing we call church. Well, we're to exhort one another, encourage one another, be there for one another. And so much the more as you see the day approaching. What day is it talking about? That same day that he was talking about in the previous verse we read earlier in the chapter, the second coming. We're going to keep doing this so we can encourage each other and uplift each other and be there for each other as we wait for him to return.
Nobody can do it all.
Ah, yeah, no one can do it all.
I don't think back then when this was written, they had as much going on in the churches as what.
They had a lot going on, but we have a lot going on now too,
Some
don't we?
churches got softball teams.
Yeah. Where I grew up, everyone played softball where I grew up, and every softball team was sponsored either by a tavern or a church. You had church leagues and you had the beer leagues, and that's just where I grew up. Okay, I'll give you another one. Olivet, what we call the Olivet Discourse. And this is called the Olivet Discourse. So this happens on the Mount of Olives. That's why we call it the Olivet Discourse. A discourse just means a speech. And so the actual thing that happened was that the disciples and Jesus and the disciples came out of the temple. And I didn't write the exact verse, the exact way he phrased it, but Jesus basically looks at the disciples and says, hey guys, you know this temple's not going to stand forever. And they look at him like he's an idiot because the temple was the most magnificent building around. Of course it was going to last forever. And of course, Jesus is actually sort of, I don't know, playing with them. He's trying to teach them some things, but there's some hidden things in what he's trying to teach him, because he was really talking about how he was going to die, you know, and things like that. We won't go into all that, but they start, they're saying, you know, wait a minute, the temple falling down and all that kind of stuff. When is all that going to happen? 24:3, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? How will we know when the world is going to end? And he goes through a long list of things, so we're not going to discuss now. We'll talk about some of them later when we get to, in a couple of weeks, to the tribulation and everything. But he ends it with, well, actually it's not in the end, but in the middle of it he says, they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So he's talking, this whole Olivet Discourse is on the idea of what things will be like in that end times when he returns. Oh, there's more and more and more. We will go all through all of it, but there's a bunch of it in the Old Testament, because Ronnie asked about the Old Testament. Turns out there's a bunch of stuff about his first coming, but also a bunch of stuff about his second coming in the Old Testament. Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 4. I guess I won't read it all, but I'll read a little bit of it. It says, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women's ravished. I guess I will read it all, because it's interesting. And half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against these nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jesus on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it towards the south. So there's a bunch of stuff going on here. Again, we don't want to get into all the details now. We'll talk about some of the details later. But he's basically saying there's a day coming. He calls it the day of the Lord, which there's going to be a lot of battles. And who's going to be trampled in all that battle? Jerusalem, the Jews. And things like houses rifled and women ravished and things like that. And half the city shall go into captivity. And if you read any bit of history, you say, well, that could have been almost any time, right? That's happened more than once, including if you read the newspaper, you see, attacks on Israel and things like that. But he says something that makes us say that wasn't still in the past, something still future. Because he says, Christ will return. He says, then the Lord shall go forth and fight in the nations, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. And when that, so the Lord is going to come down. We understand this to be Jesus, but here it says the Lord comes down. He's going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and what happens? The Mount of Olives, this mountain outside of Jerusalem, is going to split in half. By the way, where is it going to happen? Well, the Mount of Olives, which is the same place that Jesus was giving that discourse, and the same place the disciples were looking up there and said, he's going to come back. Whoa. This is Zechariah writing this more than 1,000 years before. Well, not quite that much, but hundreds of years before Christ came along. In Luke, we won't go through it all. I'm going to run out of time if I'm not careful here. But in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, it talks about Jesus going into this is early in Jesus' ministry, he goes into the synagogue and he starts teaching. And he's teaching out of the book of Isaiah, and he reads half of a verse in Isaiah. It's actually from Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. Starts reading, and he stops in the middle of the verse. What he says is, he says the part that he ends with is to preach the acceptable year of the Lord, and then reads off a phrase that says, and the day of vengeance of our God. So why would he read half of a verse and leave off the other half? Because the other half hasn't happened yet. He was there and he was fulfilling the first part of the verse. He wasn't fulfilling the second part of the verse yet. That's still coming in the future. And then there's that whole book of Revelation. And again, I only picked a few verses here, but the whole book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 1, verses 7 and 8. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all the kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, amen, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. He cometh in the clouds. That's the first part of Revelation. You go back to the last part of Revelation, and again, there's lots of prophecy in the middle there that we aren't going to deal with right now. But in Revelation 22, the last verses of the scriptures say, he which testify these things saith, surely I come quickly. Amen. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. Whew. So I just threw out a whole bunch of verses talking about the second coming, but none of those really have a lot of detail or about the chronology or anything like that. But they hint at it, and so we're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks looking at that. And I was debating about the best place to really jump into this, and we're going to jump into the middle of it rather than the beginning or the end to tease it a little bit, and then we'll firm some things up next week. Okay, so we're going to talk about millennials. Okay, how many of you are millennials in here? Yeah. You know, the skinny jeans and avocado toast type you like. Okay. You're not quite not quite. Do you eat avocado toast? Or wear skinny jeans? Okay, lots of stereotypes about it. We're not going to talk about those millennials, okay? We're really talking about the millennium. Okay, I'm a boomer. I fully embrace that. You know, boomers don't like the millennials, but that's okay. No one else likes the millennials. But that's okay. The millennials don't care either. So.
Isn't a millennial a person that was born after the year 2000?
No, that's Gen. I forget which ones. I used to know all this stuff.
They were born like 1981 to whatever, but yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
So I'm on the cusp.
Okay. How about you? Are you a millennial? Yeah, there you go. I'm not throwing rocks at millennials. I raised 3 millennials, at least 2 of which won't admit to being millennials, but they are. Okay, I'm not going to throw rocks at them other than to make fun of the name because we're going to talk about millenniums. So what's a millennium? Well, what's milli mean? Why do we call them millennials?
1,000.
It means 1,000. Milli means 1,000. And so the idea of a millennium is a period of 1,000 years. And that shows up in prophecy, mainly from this one verse in Revelation chapter 20, 1 through 10. I don't know if I can get by without reading it all. It says, and I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. There's that millennial millennium comes from. And cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal upon him that he should deceive the nations no more till 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season. And I saw thrones, and it talks about a bunch of judgments and marks on beasts and things like that. I don't want to get wrapped up in the details here. And you're saying, wow, this is sort of like that dream I had after I had pizza too close to bedtime. There's some wild stuff going on here. And when that 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, a bunch of stuff. There's also some references that don't call it 1,000 years, but refer to it like in Zechariah and Daniel and things like that. So how do we interpret those verses? Well, that's a big question, okay? And that's sort of the $100 question we're going to talk about today. How do we interpret those verses? And all these other prophetic verses? Because there's several ways to think about this. Really two main ways. But which of these ways you pick really changes, as we're going to see, what you think about the end times, and really changes how you think about the scriptures in general, how you think about salvation and things like that. So this is really an important concept. It's called hermeneutics, is what it's called from a theological standpoint, which is just a fancy name of saying how do we interpret things, how do we understand things, what context. And this is sort of like what does the Bible really say? And there's really two main approaches. One is called the literal approach, or sometimes known as the grammatical and historical approach. And that holds that the scriptures should be interpreted literally in the normal and plain sense. Unless the passage obviously intends something to be symbolic or figures of speech are being employed. Obviously, the Bible has lots of figures of speech and symbols and things like that. But this approach says you have to understand that except where the context really says this is a symbol, you should take it literal. And even if it says it's a symbol, that symbology should be rooted in the literal interpretations. Okay? In addition, passages must be interpreted historically, grammatically, and contextually through the lens of the culture that you're in, the background and the situation that prompted the text. That's why when I read verses, I like to say, well, wait a minute, where's this verse coming from? I'm not just plucking it out of the middle, but it has some context around it. It has other verses and who's writing and why are they writing it. And so the literal approach or the grammatical historical approach says you got to understand all that stuff if you really want to understand the verse. So the verses should be understood in the context of verses around them and the book they appear in, and really the entire Bible. And again, it does recognize the use of symbology, figures of speech, parables, but they have to be connected to the context, to either something literal, either in the immediate context or in the broader context of the entire scriptures. Make sense? You'd say, isn't that the way everybody does it? And the answer is no, that's not the way everyone else does it. And that's the big point. And if you hang around here, around this church and churches like it, you'll get exposed to this historical grammatical or literal approach. But there are a lot of folks that take a much different approach to the scriptures. We usually call that the allegorical method. And again, life is these are broad categories. There's things in the middle. But basically the allegorical approach says that scripture must be consistently interpreted in a non-literal sense. As the interpreter seeks out hidden or symbolic meanings in words and phrases. By the way, this one's for you, Ronnie. Origen was one of the primary proponents of this. We're talking about Origen in our Sunday school class this week. And so this is you ask what's Origen's contribution to the world? It gets me all fired up. This is it.
I thought we didn't like that guy.
We don't. Because I reject the allegorical method. But I'm going to tell you what the allegorical method is, because I think it's important that you know what it is, even though we reject it. Okay? You ought to know why. At least I reject it. I can't make the decision for all you. You all have to decide how you're going to interpret the scriptures.
Does it count to be a prophet?
No, we'll take that discussion later. You can ask, that is a legitimate question though, is why are people taking an allegorical approach? Here's my next This method arose around the beginning of the 3rd century AD through the school at Alexandria, where Origen became a champion of it. That's what we just talked about. Later, Augustine of Hippo advocated the article method for interpretation of prophetic writings, although for revelation, although he used the literal method for other scriptures, when it came to prophecies, he used the allegorical method. There's some different types of ways in which you do this, but there's something called anagological interpretation, which is just a variant of the allegory. We won't get bogged down in the detail. Here's an example, though, to help you really firm in your mind. Consider the story of Noah and the ark. You're all familiar with the story, right? At least, you're familiar with the story. The literal approach says it literally happened the way that it happened. That there was a man named Noah. He built an ark. He got the animals on the ark and got his family in the ark. God destroyed the world, and it happened just the way that we say in Genesis. The allegorical, huh?
It took a long time.
Yeah, it did. This is the Cliff Notes version, right? The allegorical method says that's not what we should be getting out of that passage in Genesis chapters 6 to 8. An allegorical interpretation, so nothing in my view, in that context, if you read Genesis 6 to 8, nothing really indicates that it should be taken as not literal. Now, there's some symbology involved, right? We talk about, the ark being a symbol of our salvation, and as God shut up the ark to preserve Noah, so it is with our salvation and things like that. But none of that discounts the fact that it was a literal event, because the context says this is a literal event. The allegorical method takes a different approach. Says the allegorical interpretation of the passage holds that the events did not actually occur, but instead the scriptures capture a morality fable, illustrating both the wrath of God and his provision of shelter for his people. It basically says there was no Noah, but there's this story to give us the lesson. Just as in...
Oh, that's fiction?
Yeah, so most of you are familiar with Aesop's fables, right? Aesop fables are things like, the ant and the grasshopper and, things like that, and the tortoise and the hare. And was there really a tortoise and a hare that set out on a race? No. It's a story to illustrate a truth. In the case of the tortoise and the hare, it's, you shouldn't be fast and flashy. You should be slow and steady and persistent. The fact that there was no real hare and real tortoise is not, we just say it's a fable. Well, they look at the scriptures as a fable. Much of the scriptures, not everything, but they look at much of the fables. And in this case, they look at the tale of Noah, not as a capture of an historical event, but as a fable that teaches a morality lesson about God's wrath and God's provision and care. By the way, this is very much tied to your view on scriptural inerrancy. If you believe in scriptural inerrancy, you tend towards a literal method. If you tend to believe not in scriptural inerrancy, if you believe that the Bible could have errors and wrong things, and that sort of leads you down this, path of the allegorical method. So why go through all this? Before I go there, we're doing okay on time here.
We have a group of bald archaeologists that will prove.
Yeah. Ronnie's been through my bald archaeologist series of videos, so.
That will prove that Noah really happened.
I would put it this way, and we're going to tie this back into the eschatology, the end time stuff, in just a second, so hang with me. So, who believes in a inspired and authoritative, inerrant scriptures? Well, we do, and other fundamentalists and some evangelical groups and things like that, and they take a literal approach. There are some evangelical groups that take a slightly different approach. It actually turns out to be significantly different. They would say that the Bible is inspired or authoritative and inerrant in matters of faith and practice, but may not be inerrant in matters of history or science. So the Bible might have science errors in it, might have history errors, things like that. But when it comes to matters of faith, and a lot of evangelical groups will have that. And that's literal, but with some allegorical sprinkled in there. And then you got like ones that believe that the Bible is a historical document containing God's truths, but it needs to be reinterpreted in every age by people of that time and place. So that's a varying mix of literal and allegorical methods. Mainline Protestant groups like Presbyterian Church USA and United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, things like that would sign up for that view. You have some that believe the Bible, like the writings of other great religions, contains moral truths that are valuable to us, even though maybe there's not a lick of factual truth or historical truth in it. It's mostly allegorical, and some of the liberal Protestant groups like the Quakers and Unitarian Universalists and such on believe that. And there's even another view that sort of is outside of this, that the Bible can only be properly interpreted by church leadership. And it may be supplemented by tradition or continued revelation and things like that. Roman Catholicism believes that. Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, things like that believe in continued tradition. Oh, so all that. So I wanted to talk about the hermeneutics. You may say, well, why did we go through all that, that allegorical versus literal approach? Because we need that as a groundwork to when we talk about end times events and how we're going to interpret. Because, let's face it, there are some pretty wild things. We already read some of those wild things. We got to ask the question, well, what are we going to do with those wild things? I read some stuff on the millennium there, and I even skipped over some of the wildest part of it. But about Satan being bound and this and that and this happened. And you read the rest of Revelation about a third of the world dying and meteors falling from the sky and the rise of a beast out of the sea. And you got all that stuff going on. And you don't even have to go to Revelation. You can go to other parts of the Bible and see some pretty wild stuff when it comes to prophecy. And the question is, well, how are we going to interpret that? Where are we going to fit on this historical, grammatical, or literal approach compared to this allegorical approach? Are we going to take them literally? Again, recognizing there's symbology and things like that. There's the fact that sometimes people see things and they don't really have the right words to describe it. We got to take all that into account. But these aren't just allegories. They're captured of historical events that haven't happened yet. I like to read time travel novels, and you always run into that trouble of how do you describe something that is going to happen in the future, and you're from the future, so you know it's going to happen. It's historical to you, but it's not historical to the time you're in. I don't know the words. But that's what prophecy is all about, right? It's describing things that are going to happen in the future. Or are we going to interpret those to be allegorical, referring to something not what it would literally say? For instance, many folks would say, that is not that the whole idea of throwing Satan into the pit at the end of the millennium and stuff is not a reference to the literal Satan being thrown into a literal pit, but is some allegorical reference to what happens to us in Christ with our salvation and things like that. Lots of different interpretations, but none of them are directly connected to what the words say.
Are we comparing a prediction of Revelations to a Noah that's already happened? History versus prediction?
Are we?
Sounds like it.
We are. As a matter of fact, I was going to bring the verse and I didn't, because I was going to save it till next week or the week after. There's a verse that says something along the lines of, people persist in, and I'm totally paraphrasing here, people look back and say, things have never changed, things have always been the same, and they discount Noah. and it calls out Noah. I wish I could, normally I could remember that verse. I can't right now. We used it in our creation class quite a few times. So to paraphrase what it says is that a lot of people will say that prophecy stuff is all hooey because nothing ever changes. Things are always the same.
Yeah.
Bingo. And the answer is, well, not everything has changed, but things did change a lot in the past, and in the same way, the verse says, things will change in the future. So it is a direct comparison, not a one-for-one comparison, but it is drawing the analogy between what happened with Noah and the flood with what's going to happen at the second coming. So your question is very insightful. Thank you.
I like to hear this guy speak when Revelations happen.
Okay.
Can we believe in that?
You won't have to. Well, you won't have to. You'll have a sideline seat. You'll be in the back row of the charge of horses, but that's coming up later. Okay, so let's get back to how do people understand. So I'm still starting. This is all the background, really, but I think setting the background is important for as we go forward in this. So how did these different groups understand the millennium? How do we in the Christian world, nominally Christian world, understand the idea of the millennium? Well, what's one? You tell me. How do people understand the millennium?
I worked with a guy when I was in Nebraska who believed we were in the millennium now.
That is called, that's the first one on my list. Thank you, Angela, that's perfect. That is called nunc millennialism, sometimes called amillennialism. Means none, and there's actually some distinction between the two. Nunc means now, so nunc millennialism means we're in the millennium now. So, no, we're in the millennium. It's been going on, most of them believe, for the last 2,000 years. That the millennium started when Christ died. And we've been in the millennium for 2,000 years. This, by the way, is, with a little bit of variation, what the Roman Catholic Church believes. They believe in nunc millennialism. So Christ will return in the future. Again, we sometimes call it amillennialism, no millennialism, but to be formally correct, at least the Roman Catholic Church believes in nunc millennialism, which is the idea that we are in the midst of the millennium now. Jesus is coming again sometime in the future, but we're living in the millennium now, and at the end of that millennium, he will come back. Other folks, there's another variation of this that says there is no millennium at all. Matter of fact, lots of folks that believe Christ isn't even going to return at all. Now, that's not the standard Roman Catholic understanding, doctrine as I understand it. But there are still lots of people that say they believe in the first coming of Christ, but believe he's not coming again. Once was all we got. And they would argue there is no millennium. Well, what do they do with that passage in Revelation? Well, you have to allegorize it away. You have to say it's not talking about real events, that stuff we read. It's talking about other stuff that only sounds like real events, about Satan being bound and 1,000 years. 1,000 years shouldn't be understood literally or anything like that. So whether and of course, in order to do that, you have to take an allegorical approach to the scriptures. There's nothing directly in that passage in Revelation 20 that I read that makes it read like it should be taken as anything other than literal events. Prophetic literal events, but literal events. Again, there's plenty of symbolism involved in those literal events, but literal events that are still future. So that's amillennialism or nunc millennialism, the idea that we are in the millennium now. And my only response to that is, well, that doesn't sound like a whole lot like the millennium that the scriptures talk about. And they say, that's because you're not reading the scriptures right. You have to take the allegorical approach. Because the millennium that I read about is, in Revelation and other places, is a pretty good place to be. And I look around and I say, you know,
You're on the right side.
this world sort of, yeah, we'll talk about that. This world sort of sucks. You know, we live in a fallen world. Now, there's lots of good things about it, lots of things I enjoy in this world, including you all, okay? But, you know, all things considered, you know, church and relations and family and things like that, 5 stars, well, maybe some of them 4 stars, but, you know, but society in general, you know, 1 star would not recommend. That's sort of our view of today's world. I say this ain't the millennium the way I read in scriptures. The allegorical approach would say, well, that's because you're not reading the scriptures allegorically. And I'd say, I agree, I'm not. Okay? So there's one other. So that's sort of the amillennial or nunc-millennialism view. Got another one that you've heard people talk about? Well, there's something called post-millennialism. The basic idea, and again, I don't want to get too wrapped up about the events and timelines. We'll talk some more about that later. And for amillennialism and nunc-millennialism and post-millennialism stuff, we don't need to get wrapped up about the timing too much. That's, you know, that's to go take one of the courses or something. We'll talk about that a little more. But I do want to give you the flavor that there's another view that says Christ is returning after the millennium. We're not in the millennium now. We're working up towards it. But that view of the millennium is that eventually, the basic theme here is that eventually the church will evangelize the entire world. Usually it falls short of saying the entire world will be saved, but it does say that society will get better and better and better, and you know, and things will improve, and every place will become Christian, even if not every person is Christian. And at some point, then the kingdom of Christ will be established by the church, and then Christ will come and assume the throne. So Christ will come and assume the throne at the end of the establishment of the kingdom, and that establishment of the kingdom is the church's job. This is very common in Reformed theology. Actually, most of the mainline Protestants have some sort of view along this line. And what do you think about that?
From watching the news, I can't believe that's ever going to happen.
Oh, yeah, that would be my...
Life, there's never been
I would say that...
My father's whole life, his grandfather's whole life.
Yeah.
We've never had world peace.
So the mathematician would say, well, the trend line on the graph is going in the wrong direction for what I just said, right? Now, it is true that the scriptures are going out to places now that they never have been.
Israel was formed in one day.
Yeah, and Israel was formed in one day. But I can't really say that society as a whole is getting better and better. I mean, now, every generation decries what the generation that follows them is doing to their society, right? There's a famous story about Socrates or someone like that complaining about how all the Greek philosophers that came up behind him are just ruining everything because, you know, they did it so good, and the bunch behind them were just lazy, no good nicks. And so it's our right as old people, my right as an old person, to complain about those millennials and those Gen Zers and Gen Xers, and you know, everybody can, just like the generation before me complained about my generation, and probably rightly so. But the trend line's sort of in the wrong direction. There's nothing that I look around and say, well, that indicates that indeed Christ is going to return to a grand and glorious kingdom set up by the earth and by the church, in which all the earth has been evangelized and peace is breaking out all over.
What I remember from Revelations is it's going to be a big fight.
Yeah, so hang on to that thought just a second. So is peace breaking out all over?
So here's what I think that is being missed here. There's a verse in Psalms that says he will rule with a rod of iron.
Oh.
I don't think that that's peace per se.
And we'll talk about some when we get to talking about the millennium in more detail. We'll talk about things like that. That's a good point.
That happens after the Antichrist.
So we'll talk about some of the timing in a week or two.
locked up. He's locked up in jail.
Okay.
You know, for 1,000 years, his influence is not present. But
But-
it also means that Christ is in complete control and he's ruling with a rod of iron.
Okay. And we will, when we talk about the millennium, we'll talk about that. But in this view, mankind, the church, establishes that peace. There's not the view that we'll talk about in the premillennial version, in which Christ returns riding on a white horse to save the day. It is the job of the church to, and Ronnie says, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound anything like what the Revelation I read either. Yeah, it doesn't sound, well, so how do you get there? Well, you have to,
If you believe.
no. So how do you get to a postmillennial view? Well, you have to allegorize all those passages that we talked about in Revelation. You're going to allegorize them in a different way than in the nunc-millennialism or amillennialism. But you have to say, no. When it talks, all those gory things that are happening in the book of Revelation aren't really the gory things in the book of Revelation. There's spiritual things going on and stuff like that, despite the language looking like it's a literal thing. And you have to take an allegorical approach to get to. And for instance, here's a common one. There's a big angel that appears in the middle of Revelation. I forget just which chapter it is now. I got it written down someplace. And the angel does a bunch of stuff. And they would argue that angel was really the Reformation. I'd say, well, I don't know how you get that angel being the Reformation, unless that's a big allegorical step. So if you're taking a literal approach to the Bible, you're getting to something that we call premillennialism. Premillennialism is the idea that the millennium has not happened yet. At some time in the future, it will happen, and usually we say it's a literal 1,000 years, because we read the verse, and there's nothing to indicate it wasn't a literal 1,000 years. And it comes, we call it premillennial, because Christ returns at the beginning of the millennium, and we go into the millennium stage. And there are a bunch of things that we'll learn about the millennium when we get around to studying it. Angela already pointed out, a couple of things, and so I think Ronnie or someone has pointed out a bunch of things. And there's a bunch of things before Christ's return we got to point out. That's the tribulation and all that kind of stuff. We're going to have to look at all that, but that's going to be like in another week or two. Okay? So we got these three different views, and so I want to, and by the way, for premillennialism, there's also actually a couple of different variations of that. One is called historical premillennialism, and one's called dispensational premillennialism. And historical premillennialism used to be, back 2,000 years ago, the way that the early church fathers really believed back in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. There's still some groups around that believe the historical. We won't dive into the differences. But most premillennialists, including Hal Lindsey, when he writes his book, and all those guys on TV, tend to teach a premillennial, dispensational premillennial. So you'll hear those words. So if anyone asks, tell them, at least I am, and you can tell them you are if you are, you're a dispensational premillennialist. You say, well, what the heck is that? Well, we're going to have to talk about that in another week or so. Okay, so here's a good way to think about both the second coming and the millennium. We'll fill this in some more in the coming weeks when we talk about the tribulation and things like that. But the second coming, premillennial believes that it's a literal event and usually preceded by the rapture. There's some variations with historical. Usually, let's say it's accompanied by the rapture or simultaneous with the rapture, but most believe it's it's before the rapture. There's a tribulation period in there. Postmillennialists would say that the second coming is a single event and they wouldn't distinguish with the rapture or anything like that, but postmillennialists would say the second coming happens at the end of the millennium, not at the beginning of the millennium. But it happens after the church establishes the millennium, the kingdom, and then Christ comes down to rule, says, good job, guys, now I'm here to rule. And then there's amillennium that says, there is no literal millennium, or we are in the middle of the millennium. And the second coming may or may not, depending on just on view, may happen eventually, but the focus is not on that as a singular event. Does all that make sense? Does that strike your curiosity? Do we have any questions? We need to sort of start fitting some of the real meat and potatoes on that. That was sort of a backbone thing to give us the historical. We need to look at some of the prophecies like in Daniel and stuff like that to start establishing what are these things. We'll talk about the age of the Gentiles, and then why we think we're still in the age of Gentiles, what's going to happen in the rapture, what's going to happen at the second coming, what's going to happen in the millennium, and what's going to happen after the millennium. Ronnie?
When Jesus locks up Satan,
Yep.
and then rules with an iron sword, do we lose our free will?
No.
Rod of iron.
Nope. But we'll talk about that when we get to it, probably 2 weeks. Okay?
It's kind of interesting that with modern technology, a lot of people are asserting that the mark of the beast is either a barcode or a chip.
Yeah. So as a matter of fact,
Seal.
I grew up with that. Here, okay, I got my copy of the late great Planet Earth. I can't remember if Lindsay actually says that or not. He was more into, but yes, things like barcodes and
Behind series
yeah.
talks about a chip.
Yes. If you read Left Behind, which sort of, or what are some of the other ones? What's the other one we talk about?
But it sounds feasible. So
Yeah.
it could be a
Yes. And
Actually, there's a company that has developed a chip that
Sure.
you can place in the palm of their hand. They just scan
Yes.
it for
Yeah.
logging into computers, logging, or paying
Yeah.
for things and stuff like that.
yeah, you'll say as we go and wander through this, and again, we only have a couple weeks, so we're not going to go dive into this too much detail. I sort of take a middle of the line approach in saying, I don't want to read too much into any single headline event or technology event or something like that. On the other hand, I can sort of nod my head and say, yeah, I can see where
They've been chipping dogs.
I've been chipping dogs for a long time, and so I can see where that could be used. Am I going to say, well, the barcode is the mark of the beast? Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I can see where technology can be used, and one of the whole reasons for doing our end of the times was, people have been saying stuff like this for 2,000 years. People have been saying, well, here's ultimate proof that the end of time is right around the corner. And say, well,
I don't think the Apostle John was thinking about barcodes.
yeah, Apostle John was not thinking about barcodes as he wrote the book of Revelation. But now we can look back and we can say, well, I can see where, modern surveillance and tracking, I mean, it's scary when you think how much every time you buy something online and how, all your digits are tracked and all that kind of stuff, and how much, and you say, well, I'm not saying, but I could see where, an Antichrist could use stuff like that, again, I sort of take a middle line approach. I'm not so quick to say, well, that's clearly proof, but on the other hand, I'm starting to say, I can see the trends as well. Yeah, I can see the possibilities as well. Yes. So, okay. Any last questions before we end? Excellent discussion, guys. Good questions, good comments. Excellent. We'll continue this next week. We'll start in Daniel, and we'll sort of lay the groundwork for with the four kingdoms, and we'll figure out why. We'll start delving into the tribulation, and then we'll continue on and look at some more details of the second coming and the millennium in a little bit more detail. Again, we can't treat this all to a lot of depth, but hopefully in a couple of weeks we'll get enough that we have a basic understanding. So the next time you watch that TV show, you can say, yeah, that makes sense, or no, now you're out to lunch. So, okay, thanks. Okay.